Is this on? Oh, good evening. I'm Alexandra Wetlaufer. I'm the new director of the Plan 2 Honors Program, and I'm delighted to welcome you. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2017 Liz Carpenter Lecture featuring the legendary Dan Rather. First, however, I'd like to introduce Liz Carpenter's children, Christy Carpenter and Scott Carpenter. Please stand. And her beloved grandchildren, Les Carpenter, and Bonnie Bazell. We are so pleased they're here with us tonight. There's a particularly profound feeling of rightness, even divine justice, in introducing Dan Rather to give the Liz Carpenter Lecture in the Lyndon Baines Johnson Auditorium at the University of Texas tonight. As this remarkable pair of Texas journalists first met in 1964, when Liz was working as Lady Bird's press secretary in the LBJ White House, and Mr. Rather was appointed as the CBS White House correspondent following his extraordinary coverage of Kennedy's assassination the previous year. Ms. Carpenter, who in Liz Smith's words, quote, knew everybody and forgot nothing, showed Dan Rather the ropes in Washington with her characteristic generosity and aplomb, leading to a 40-year friendship. Both continued on to long and distinguished careers in journalism, Liz in print, Dan on television, and I'm calling them Liz and Dan, but they're part of our lives. Liz in print, Dan on television, to the point that each stands as an avatar, an icon, I think, of political reporting in the late 20th century. And their voices, unflinching, insightful, compelling, often funny, and frequently enhanced by a Texan turn of phrase, stand for many of us as the very essence of an era when reporting the news was an art form rather than a circus. A serious endeavor that engaged and even challenged the audience to grapple with the difficult, messy, and controversial issues of the day, civil rights, women's rights, the ideals of the Great Society, in ways that were thoughtful and probing rather than inflammatory. They both embodied a love of language and a respect for the intelligence of their readers and viewers that are becoming harder and harder to find in a world where entertainment threatens to supplant hard reporting, and the very concept of fake news, once an oxymoron, haunts our nation. I know that many in this room and across the country can only wonder WWLCS. What would Liz Carpenter say about the last 9 or so months or 15 months or whatever we want to say in America? And we can only be certain that this outspoken and self-proclaimed yellow dog Democrat would have had us all laughing, Democrats and Republicans alike. Fortunately for all of us, although Liz Carpenter is no longer with us, Dan Rather is. And he remains as vital a voice today as ever. With a storied career that has spanned more than 6 decades, it goes without saying that Dan Rather is one of the world's best-known journalists. He's interviewed every president since Eisenhower and, over that time, personally covered almost every important dateline in the United States and around the world. Rather joined CBS News in 1962, and after quickly rising through the ranks, he assumed the position of anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News in 1981, a post he held for 24 years. His reporting across the network helped turn 60 Minutes into a Sunday night institution, launched 48 Hours as an innovative news magazine program, and shaped countless specials and documentaries. Upon leaving CBS, Rather returned to the in-depth reporting that he always loved, creating the Emmy Award-winning Dan Rather Reports on HDNet. Now, building upon that foundation, he is president and CEO of News and Guts, an aptly named independent production company he founded that seeks to build off the best traditions of 20th century journalism while taking advantage of the exciting world of 21st century digital distribution and social media. Recognizing that the traditional silos of content between video, audio, and text are rapidly dissolving, News and Guts is developing projects that take full advantage of the new media landscape and reach a new and ever-broadening audience. Indeed, Dan Rather, who was in our living rooms for so many decades, is now what the Business Insider has called a wildly popular presence on our laptops via Facebook, and one of the most revered figures of the golden age of television, has claimed a similar position in the realm and the era of social media. Next month, his new book, What Unites Us? Reflections on Patriotism, will appear from Algonquin Books. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Rather.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for that warm reception home to Texas. And thank you very much for that generous introduction. I trust you all know what Abraham Lincoln said about such introductions. Honest Abe said, never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves. and so it will be with you here tonight. It is a pleasure to be here, and particularly an honor to be here with something in memoriam for my departed friend, Liz Carpenter, who was so wonderful to me when I first came to Washington for the first time as a White House correspondent. I have so much ground I want to cover with you here tonight. I hope you know that what's going to happen is that I'm going to be here for a few minutes, and then I'll be sitting down with Professor Rich Reddick over to answer his questions. So the program is basically in two parts. I wish I could say to you that I had some great wisdom to lay on you about where we are in the world at the moment, how to cope with the geopolitical challenges we have, to say nothing with the perilous period we're going through as a country. But, you know, I can be dumb as a fence post about a lot of things. But at least I'm smart enough to know, at this advanced stage anyway, who I am. And folks, this was billed to you as a lecture, and I'm not going to say that there was any fraud involved, but among the many things I am not as a lecturer. Look, I'm a lifetime reporter. I'm a story hunter, a story breaker, and a storyteller. So I hope that you'll take my remarks in that spirit. And having said that, let me start with a story, which, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, this story has the added advantage of being true. I'm told that some other people have adopted it for their purposes, and that's fine, but this story happened. The time is the early 1980s, and the place is New York City to begin with. After 20 years as a field correspondent, White House correspondent, war correspondent, foreign correspondent, I was named to succeed the rightfully legendary Walter Cronkite. Please note that I said succeed. No one replaces an iconic figure such as a Cronkite, but I was named to succeed him as anchor and managing editor of the CBS News. I was, to say the least, thrilled by it. I was somewhat surprised, but thrilled by it. But then the leaders of the corporation, not so much the news division itself, although they were involved, took me aside and said, Dan, we've chosen you for this because we think in the medium and long range it's going to work out very well. But no one succeeds a legend such as Cronkite and not go through a difficult transition period. So you should know, they said to me, Dan, that we expect the ratings to go down, may go down quite a bit for at least a year and a half or 2 years. We think after that time, the audience will get accustomed to you, but you have to be prepared for what we know is going to be a down period in the ratings and demographics. Well, that certainly got my attention. As luck would have it, having very little to do with me personally, but that did not happen. After a little bit, the ratings actually went up slightly. Demographics got better, having to do some things. At any rate, by the time I took the chair in 1981, by the time we got to late 1982 or 1983, the ratings are terrific. They're as good or better than they've ever been. We were bearing our competition. Everything was just terrific, and everybody was full of praise. And just to cut it short and get the point, that I became big-headed. Conceited would not be too strong a word. This is not uncommon in television, you may have noticed. But I had a bad case of it. At any rate, I came home one night, and Fighting Heart, Jeannie Grace Goebel, rather, of Winchester, Texas, my wife of 60 years, who's seated down here with me here. Thank you. I come home at night. We had 2 young children at the time, and Jean says to me after dinner, she says, Dan, if your head gets any bigger, we won't be able to get you in the front door. This is awful, this is terrible. And she explained to me that, you're getting full of yourself. And of course, she suggested a remedy. It's always true in the Rather household, any problem, any illness, anything, go home to Texas. So we were going to do that to sort of get myself back in touch with roots. So we took the kids, we flew the usual thing, we flew to Austin. Both my parents were gone by this time, and Jean's parents were still living in Winchester, Texas, which is slightly north and west of here. If you haven't heard of Winchester, the closest I can tell you is between Smithville and Giddings. It's a village of population of 35, 20 of whom are Jean's family. At any rate, we get in the car, and you get to Winchester the usual way. We rented a car, had the kids in the car, and you drive on a 8-lane federal highway, it seemed to be for a ways, and then a state double highway. Eventually, you reach a 2-lane blacktop road, which gives way to a rock road. The rock road leads to a dirt road, and at the end of that dirt road is Winchester. So we're making this drive on a hot day, and we got to the place where the blacktop meets the rock road. And there was there a new business, a combination filling station, service station, and sort of a 7-Eleven kind of convenience store. Jean says, this is new, give a stop. I'll go in and get a few Dr. Peppers for the kids, just keep the air conditioner running and the car running. And she did, she went inside. But she stayed in an inordinately long time. She was there, I looked at my watch, first 10 minutes, first 15 minutes, and then 20 minutes she stayed. She comes back with the Dr. Peppers, and I made 2 mistakes. Any of you who have been married and are husbands for any length of time will recognize these mistakes. She gets in the car, and mistake 1, I said, damn, honey, that took an awful long time to get 4 Dr. Peppers. And I did notice through the plate glass window on the convenience store that you were having a long conversation with a man about your age. Jean said very quick, she said, oh, Dan, pull on off here. She said, that's nothing. She said, it turns out that the person who just bought and is operating this combination service station and convenience store is Luther Zimmerhansel. And I went with Luther Zimmerhansel in school. I dated him in school a long time ago. Hadn't seen him since. Then I made my second mistake. So I said with a bit of a smirk, I said, well, Jeannie, if things had taken a little different turn here or there, you might be out here helping old Luther run this combination service station and convenience store. And don't you know, she didn't miss a beat. She said to me, no, Dan, you don't understand. If I had married Luther Zimmerhansel, he would be the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News. The point of telling you that story, in addition, is in our family lore, and I enjoy telling it. It was the beginning of my revelation of the importance of gratitude, humility, and modesty. And Jean, who's responsible for just about every good and decent thing I've ever done as an adult, was responsible a beginning of that wisdom. Another story I want to tell you, having said to you, I'm going to tell you some stories. That story has to do with dealing with the sort of unreal world of anchoring a daily television program and having nearly everybody who's around you tell you how great you are. The lesson to be learned out of that. I had an earlier lesson, a much earlier lesson, at where I started in radio. I always wanted to be a print reporter. I started out in print being a wire service reporter, a newspaper reporter, but in college, I had worked at the radio station in Huntsville. I went to Sam Houston, what was then Sam Houston State Teachers College. Now, this radio station was not a college radio station. There was no such thing as college radio stations so far as we knew. This was a regular commercial enterprise, and I'm asking you, and for those who are not being patronizing who are younger in the audience, it may be a little difficult, conceive of this. We're talking about 1950, Huntsville, Texas, rural East Texas. The college is about 900 or 1,000 in population. The prison system is there, so the total population was probably 4,000 or 5,000. But there was this small radio station. There were hundreds of them around the country at that days. It was the smallest commercial AM powered station allowed by the FCC, 250 watt power, which frankly barely reached the city limits of Huntsville, much less any place else. But having failed as a football player, my journalism professor, the late Hugh Cunningham, got me a series of odd jobs to stay in college. And one of those jobs was to go out to KSAM. The station was KSAM, KSAM, little KSAM. Now, I'm not denigrating it, but the best way to describe it, it was a little on the outskirts of town, was basically an outhouse with an antenna sticking out the top. And the part owner and full-time manager, he was the only person at the station, was the late Pastor Ted Lott. Now, Pastor Lott was an ordained Baptist minister, but he'd come on to run and operate this radio station. He'd been doing it by himself. But he brought me in. I went out to see him, and he said, look, here's what I need. I need you to come in every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. and work around to 9 o'clock in the evening, because that's what the FCC requires of our license, that we be on the air every night and every day, 6 a.m. to 9 o'clock. He said, I don't need you to do much. Basically, it's just to stay here and watch the station and occasionally stick your head up to the microphone and say it's KSAM Huntsville. That's all you have to do. I was delighted to have the job. And so the first weekend I tried the job, everything went pretty well. But I was a little disappointed in one thing. So I came in on Monday morning, and I said to Pastor Lott, I said, Pastor, everything seemed to go well this last weekend. I'm really appreciative to have this job, but there is one small problem. Pastor Lott, I always remember, he wheeled around in his swivel chair, and he said, let me stop you right there, young man. He says, if you're here to complain that we're only paying you 40 cents an hour, and that is below the federal minimum wage, I am here to tell you that federal law ain't never applied in East Texas and ain't going to start now. I said, no, Pastor, that's not the problem. And I explained to him. I said, the problem is, Pastor, that I get here at 6 a.m. in the morning, and I take the station all the way around to, on weekends, 9 o'clock or 12 o'clock. By the time we get to late afternoon, I'm famished. And by the time I get the station closed down, there's no place to eat. He saw the problem right away, and we solved it in a way which may strike you as strange if you don't understand small-town radio, but this was fairly common. So the second week I was there, we resolved the problem in the following way. I was to keep the station on the air all day, and then around 5:30 or 6 o'clock, I was to put on a long play, vinyl records, which is what we had, long play, vinyl record, with a totally complete program of its own, a half-hour program. I was to put this half-hour program on, and then I was to get in the KSAM mobile unit, which was a 1937 Plymouth pickup truck, go to the local Zesto hamburger stand, which was on Highway 75, get a hamburger and a milkshake, get back to the station, plenty of time to do that before the half hour's up. Now, this particular program, no surprise, this self-contained record that we put on to fill the half hour, featured Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother from down at Del Rio, Texas. And the program, his brother was to do a little light guitar picking, a little hymn singing, a little Bible quoting, and preach a little bit in a half hour. So the second weekend I worked at the station. The first weekend we had this plan in effect. The time came, 6 o'clock came. I put on the long play record. I hopped in the mobile unit, went down to the Zesto stand. And in the Zesto stand, I got a bad break. There was a new freshman girl there whose acquaintance I had not been able to make. And I thought to myself, this is terrific. I'll get a chance. Her name was Mary Sue Stramler. Said, I'll just have my burger and my milkshake here, and Mary Sue and I can watch and listen to the trucks go by on Highway 75, always big entertainment in Huntsville. So I did that. I took an acquaintanceship with the girl, and I got my hamburger and milkshake. I'd been there about 20 minutes when the phone rang. Any of you who've ever lived in a small town know everybody in a small town knows everybody else's voice. Mary Sue picked up the phone, and she put her hand over the receiver, and she said, Dan, it's Pastor Lott, and he does not sound in a very ministerial frame of mind. So I took the phone for her, and indeed he was in a bad mood. He was talking through his teeth. He said, Young Rather, have you heard our radio station any time in the last 20 minutes? No, sir, I said, and I told a white lie. I said, it was a long line here at the Zesto stand, but I am going back. He said, well, you get back, fix it, and you are fired. Click. I was terrified. I raced out to the KSAM mobile unit, cranked it up, turned on the radio, and there was Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother saying into the radio, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell. The record had gotten stuck in a very bad place. And any of you who've ever lived in a small town may know what 20 minutes to go to hell on the local radio station can do to your reputation. Well, the story, again, is a true story. It takes a little while to tell it, but one reason I wanted to tell it was another lesson I learned early was what the military now calls for short, focus and execute. That Pastor Lott, fortunately, didn't have anybody handy to work for 40 cents an hour. He gave me a good lecture, and through his benevolence, he kept me on. But he did say to me, he said, Dan, you got to prepare, you got to think, you got to focus on the job at hand, and then you got to execute it. He had a version of that long before I ever heard it on battlefields from military commanders. And it was a very important lesson for me to learn. It's also a way of emphasizing to you that what you have here, folks, is a reporter who got lucky, very lucky, as one who dreamed since he was a young boy of being a reporter and has lived to become one and remain one with undreamed opportunities and rewards beyond anything I could have imagined and far beyond anything I deserve. That I am much aware, as I know you are, that I stand before you with scars and some still open wounds, many of those wounds self-inflicted, from a professional lifetime of being on the line and in the journalistic trenches. I've had my successes, but I've also had my failures and made my mistakes. Have I ever? Having been in the business, the craft, for well over 2/3 of a century now, and having anchored more than well over 7,000 network news broadcasts, I cannot rule out the possibility, my friends, that I just might hold the current record for blown chances and missed opportunities. So please know that I stand before you with humility, for I do know that I have a lot to be humble about. Having said that, I want to share with you another story. In fact, we pick it up, that I sometimes ask questions of myself, even at this advanced age, of how did I get here? Is it still worth doing? Much of my career has been and is still dedicated to what we call investigative reporting, though I often think that that phrase is redundant, investigative reporting. Any reporting needs to be on at least some level investigative. But investigative reporting, as we've come to call it, has been my greatest journalism love from early on. I like doing a lot of things in journalism, but I particularly love investigative reporting. Now, how that got to be also has to do with working at that same small Huntsville radio station. That's when the moment came when the idea that I wanted to be an investigative reporter above all else gave meaning and shape to my much earlier dream of just becoming a reporter of some kind, any kind. Now, I think I was about 20, and I had that first job at the Huntsville radio station and had survived the go-to-hell aspects of it in this tiny radio station in the backwoods of East Texas. Now, one of the things that was true at that time is less true today in Huntsville, and this was very common. Whites lived in one part of town, people of African-American heritage lived in another. There was a house fire in the African-American part of town. I covered it. The bodies of several badly burned people were brought out. It was ruled very quickly accidental. A man telephoned into the radio station anonymously to say that if I checked a bit, I would find that it was actually a case of arson and that the fire had been deliberately set. I followed up that lead and soon found out, not just to my amazement, but to my astonishment at that age and that time, that at least one of the charred bodies had bullets in it. Now, a long trail wound from discovering that fact. It turned out that a white man, a powerful, influential man in the community, had shot the people in the house and set fire to cover his crimes. In the beginning, I only had a tiny piece of the story. When I sought to report what I had, the good and decent man who ran this little radio station sweated. He did not tell me not to report the story. He did say, and I paraphrase him but accurately here, a lot of people, a lot of powerful people, Dan, are not going to like what you have found out, and they're not going to like you for having found it out. If you report it, they will hate you. I sort of looked at the floor and ran my hands around the brim of my hat, to tell you the truth. I love this man, and he was terrific to me, and to his everlasting credit, he never told me not to run the story. But when I told him I felt we should report what we had, what we knew, he left town for a few days. He left me alone with the story and with the challenge of running the radio station, keeping it on the air, while at the same time fielding some not too friendly calls and personal appearances by all sorts of townfolk. Unfortunately, I wish it were otherwise, but unfortunately, I am not the hero of this story. Others, including some very good law enforcement people, eventually broke the case open with all of its horrid details. I only really brushed with it, and mine was a small peripheral contribution, if at all. But it was a learning experience for me, as you might well imagine, one that I've tried to carry with me for a lifetime, and I have been hooked on investigative reporting ever since. I've told any number of young people, particularly those aspiring to be journalists, told them not because I'm some wise old man, but because I have been a few miles and seen a few things, that be careful when you get into investigative reporting, because if you really get into it, it's more addictive than crack cocaine. Amongst the things I learned at that moment in East Texas was how hard it can be to dig out things that people, especially powerful people, don't want the public to know, which is very often, more often than not, I think, they turn out to be things that your fellow citizens need to know. I also learned that when you do this kind of reporting, not everybody's going to love or respect you for it, and that even when your reporting is right, You will catch hell. You will pay a price for it. Then, 2, there was the lesson that you better be prepared to defend every word, every single piece of this kind of reporting, that you must be prepared to defend it well and immediately. And unless you're fortunate, and very fortunate, you may sometimes have difficulty getting your superiors to stand up for you and stand with you. Besides all that, I learned from that experience in the radio station this: especially in investigative reporting, there's no room for excuse-making, for whining, blaming, or passing the buck. Eventually, when you do that kind of work, you will have to face the furnace and take the heat. Now, you can say that first story contained in it all the lessons that I would need to know about investigative reporting, and indeed maybe reporting of any kind. But I went on from that early beginning to eventually become a CBS News correspondent, cover civil rights, the Kennedy assassination, some other fairly big stories. But as I went along, it was a long way, obviously, from Huntsville to places like covering the White House. There were other lessons about reporting in general, not just investigative reporting, such as politicians don't always like the truth about themselves. This might be particularly relevant today. No, but it's in the nature of presidents and particularly high-powered politicians to not see themselves as others see them. And I'm going to tell you the story of Lyndon Johnson in the mid to late 1960s. The war was beginning to go not well. You could argue it never went well, but by this time it was becoming clear the war wasn't going well. The public was turning against President Johnson. The year was 1966, to be exact. He changed press secretaries. He brought on George Christian, one of, if not the best press secretaries any president's ever had. Christian was a tall, drawling Texan, so honest you could shoot dice with him over the telephone. He came to Johnson, and he said to President Johnson, "You know, Mr. President, I know a few things about politics, and I'm glad to help you as your press secretary, but I want to tell you, I'm not a magician. I can't do magic. And I like to work sort of methodically. So, Mr. President, if you will tell me one thing, just one thing, that really needles you, is really under your skin, and let me work on that, and let's go one step at a time." John said, "Excellent, George. I'll tell you the problem. The problem is these damn reporters and all these people, they swear that in the 1964 election, George, they say, I went around saying that I would not send American boys to do what Vietnamese boys should do for themselves." And he said, "George, I never said it. It's not only a lie, it's a damnable lie, but it's eating me up because every time I turn around, somebody's saying it." Christian said, "Okay, Mr. President, I got you. Let me go out and see what I can do." In a few days, Christian came back, and he brought into the Oval Office stacks, big stacks of boxes, all of which were filled with printed material quoting Lyndon Johnson directly as saying, "I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves." He said, "Mr. President, I haven't finished my work yet, but I just want to give you an idea. These are all publications, everything from the New York Times to the Austin Statesman, from CBS to KSAM, quote you precisely as saying that." Lyndon Johnson thundered at him and said, "George, I am surprised at you. I am really surprised at you. These print people, you know how them some bitches lie. It's not true." Christian said, "Well, okay, Mr. President, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what the challenge is." In about a week and 10 days, George came back, President Johnson. He had one of these old-fashioned tape recorders, cell power. They were about this size of a shoebox. He says to the President, "Mr. President, I'm not yet finished, but I do want to give you an update on the challenge we're facing here." He turns the tape recorder on, and there is the unmistakable voice of Lyndon Johnson saying, "I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves." President Johnson had huge hands, like a bear. He reached over and slapped and almost ruined the tape recorder, cutting it off. He drilled George and I said, "George, I am really surprised at you." He said, "You know these people, they take those razor blades, they cut these little tape things out." And I never said it, and they've just made it seem like I said. George said, "Okay." Anyway, a few days later, George came to see the president. They were in the White House movie room. The president was having some guests. They were seeing the Alamo, of course. And Christian leans over and says to the president, "Mr. President, when this is over and everybody else is on, if I could have just a few minutes with you, I'd appreciate it." The president said, "Fine, George." So he showed the movie. People, including family, filed out of the room. And the president turns and said, "Okay, George." George signals to the projectionist. And there upon the screen comes, in black and white, on a dark street corner in Philadelphia, standing on the bumper of the presidential limousine. It was film. We didn't have videotape at those days, but clear film of Lyndon Johnson saying, "I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves." It was a short clip, but it ran. The lights come on, and the president turns around to George Christian in one of my favorite Johnson quotes and said, "Damn, George, are you sure that's me?" An example, I am convinced, as Vice President Biden said on this stage last night, we all should be careful about judging people's motives. We can make an opinion about their judgments, but not about their motives. I think Lyndon Johnson had actually convinced himself that he'd never said that, and it was very hard for him to believe it. There are, on the other hand, some outright lies. It's the rare president who sometime in his presidency hasn't told a lie. Who among us can say we've never told one? But I do think, and I don't think it's a matter of opinion, I think it's a matter of demonstrated fact, that in the present circumstances, we've moved into a whole new era about what a president says, what's, quote, normal for a president to say, what's acceptable for a president to say. And I mean this in no partisan political manner, nor am I here to propose an argument for any one ideological point of view. But before we go to the question and answer session with my new friend Rich Reddick, I want to make it clear that in my storytelling here tonight, and trying to bring a little laughter at the same time, making a few points, that I've tried to do this in a spirit that is in the service of all the brave men and women who today are struggling to report the truth, or as close as it's humanly possible to reach the truth. They're trying to report the truth and facts in what is arguably one of, if not the most consequential and fraught moments for the press in American history. This institution, the institution of a free press, is enshrined in the very First Amendment to the Constitution, of course. It was envisioned by our founding fathers as an insurance policy on our democracy. And it is now, by any reasonable analysis, under withering attack. The idea of a free and independent, truly independent press is facing headwinds from many directions. The crumbling business models, the proliferation of propaganda fanned by social media that purports to be news, and sustained attacks, frequently personal attacks, from many of those in power who threw about the epithet fake news as a means to undermine the credibility of the free and independent press. The damage being done is not only to our reputation and livelihoods, we journalists. Much more importantly, it is a direct threat to the sustainability of our republic. Without facts and truth, how are we going to give the American citizens the tools they need to participate in the electoral process? Presidents, yes, it's true, have always complained of press coverage, beginning with George Washington. But in the main and in general, Washington and every other president, some more, some less, have understood journalists and valued their role. Presidents generally have understood that the Fourth Estate is as central to our strength as our military and economic power and good political leadership. What heartens me at the moment is the fact that, given the unprecedented challenges of today, reporters and the best of our journalistic institutions are rising and refusing to bend, much less break. Journalists, and particularly journalists of integrity doing quality journalism, since my friend Lair Wright is here today, and if you aren't reading his material in the New Yorker or in his books, you should be. But journalists can be a stubborn species, and our instinct is to fight back with more determination to uncover that which the powerful wish to remain hidden. As a result, the quality of investigating reporting today is at the highest level I have seen it in some time. Imagine where we'd be for a moment. Imagine where we'd be at this moment in history without a free press. A free, independent, truly independent, fiercely independent with necessary press is the red beating heart of democracy and freedom. And it's not hyperbole to say that without a free, independent, and vigorous press, our democracy can fail. That, of course, would be a disaster for those of us in the United States. It would also be disastrous for the preservation of Western civilization and, indeed, for the world at large. On that note, I will say to you, thank you for your time. I will go over to the chairs and be interviewed now by Mr. Reddick. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Rich, if I may, I know you have questions and I won't get to them.
I do.
But I feel it necessary to level with the audience, if you will.
Sure.
That if you can speak up with the questions, I'd appreciate it. I lost about 40% of my hearing in Vietnam, and age is taking care of the rest. I don't hear quite as well as I once did. But I take refuge in the story, which I wouldn't tell this story except for the fact that Betsy Cronkite, Walter Cronkite's wife, would tell the story. That Walter, late in life, into his late 80s and early 90s, also had a hearing problem. Mm-hmm. And Betsy, his protective wife, was always trying to protect him from it. She tells the story of, late in life, Walter liked to sail. They were sailing off Martha's Vineyard, and they had company on the boat, and it came Saturday afternoon, and Betsy said quietly to Walter, we need to go in and get some resupply. So they got in the dinghy and went to a place in Martha's Vineyard, which they went to often. But it was Saturday afternoon, it was a little crowded. And naturally, everybody recognizes Walter. And Walter was always great about stopping to talk to people. You know, people want to say, watch you every night, think you're wonderful. Do you remember this? And do you know so-and-so? So it was taking forever to get to the cash register because everybody wanted to talk to Walter. So as Betsy tells the story, they got up close to the cash register, and a gentleman came out of the crowd and said to Walter, do you know so-and-so and so-and-so? And Walter pulled himself up to his full height and said, well, I can't say that I know him, but I have met him, and he seemed to be a wonderful fellow. Thank you very much. They went on and get the cash register. They get outside, and Betsy, as she tells the story, said, Walter, we have to do something. That man asked you, do you know Jesus?
made your point.
Let's proceed apace.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Rather, thank you, first of all, for a fantastic speech you gave to us today. And it was really exciting to hear you speak and share your experiences. So the first question I have is from Alexis G. She asks, we are at a time where the media is often under direct attack and suspicion. Where do you see the future of journalism heading in today's world, and how can the public assist with honest and non-biased reporting?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we recognize that we have moved fully past the digital divide into the internet revolution. Journalism has gone through a number of revolutions in this country, just to name a few. Print through the 19th century, on the early 20th century. The revolution, and it was a revolution at the time of radio, which gave way to the revolution of television. And now we're in the internet age. There's a lot to worry about with the internet. I have my worries about it, but I do believe that overall, in the main, that the internet can be and will prove to be over time a tremendous force for good. In the same way, we had to approach television with a certain, if you wanted to be a responsible citizen, a responsible consumer of news, had to approach television in much the same way the late, great Edward R. Murrow did, in a paraphrase of what he said. He said, this new instrument, television, it can educate, it can inform, it can illuminate, it can be a powerful weapon, provided to relieve poverty, prevent war, for all kinds of good. But, he said, only if we use it for those purposes. Right. Otherwise, in his most famous phrase, it's nothing but lights and wires in a box. Well, as I mentioned to some students earlier here on the campus in the afternoon, that here in the internet age, the internet can do all of those things, can illuminate, inform, educate, can be a great force for good in the world, but only if we use it for that purpose. Otherwise, it's just circuitry in a pop-down box. So, in answer to your question, it's much tougher to be an informed news consumer today. It requires more work, it requires more effort. But with the internet, it's possible. There's good reporting on the internet. It's just difficult to find it. And then there's the problem of separating unreliable news and outright fake news. Some of it put on just for the hell of it, some of it put it on to exploit the internet. So I don't underestimate the problems. Your question, I think, at the core was, what do we do going forward? And I say going forward, it takes a little more work. It requires longer attention, if you will, to news sources. It's a great mistake these days to depend on any one particular source, particularly if it's social media. Right. I think, social media, again, can be a terrific force for good, but you've got to be especially careful with social media about what you're depending on. And then there is the problem, it's an ongoing problem, an outgrowth, frankly, of television in the 80s and 90s, that there's so many programs now profess to be news programs, which are in fact entertainment programs, and they are designed to be entertainment programs, posing as news programs. It doesn't take a lot of intelligence to recognize that, but sometimes you have to stay alert because, frankly, the people who do it are pretty shrewd, and they have their ways.
Thank you. Speaking of great news sources, this question is from David Wyatt. News and Guts has become a primary news source for me and for many other thinking folks. How do I, or you, keep it from becoming another echo chamber for viewpoints we already embrace and understand?
Well, first of all, David, thank you very much for your comment. No, but it's a fair question, and quite honestly, and I try to be candid, it's something we wrestle with every day. By way of background, what happened is that I started my own Facebook page, and in the context of my small company, which is called News and Guts, in which I have 10 full-time employees. In the context of our small cosmos, my Facebook page got some popularity. I'm not back in the anchorman mode here. I have this in complete context, but nonetheless. And as an outgrowth of my own personal Facebook page, we said, look, let's have a news site that's a little more active. And so we established News and Guts as a news site. We have my own Facebook page and News and Guts. Now, this is full-time work. We do other things at our company, News and Guts. We produce an hour-long program for Access Television. But for us, it's 10 people against the world. We have no financing. I finance it myself, and we finance it with when we make a profit in other things on it. So we have no advertising, we have no outside help at all. But it's true that to sustain it, just to keep it going at its present pace, we have to find some source of revenue.
Right. And
to expand it, which we would like to do, for example, to be able to expand it to do really deep digging, long-lasting investigative reporting requires more resources. So we struggle with what a lot of other people struggle with. Right now, we answer only to ourselves, and God is wonderful. but we can't keep on doing that. Do we set up a different site and take advertising? If so, what kind of advertising? Do we look for nonprofit help or philanthropic help? These are things going through, but I appreciate the question because the reality is the Facebook page, my own Facebook page, I can keep going as long as I have my health. But the News and Guts operation, we're trying to figure a business model going forward that will allow us to maintain it and, if possible, to expand it. But here in microcosm is what I mentioned in my remarks. Some version of this is facing almost everybody in journalism.
Right.
We want to do quality work. We want to do first-rate investigative reporting. We want to do international reporting. But where is the business model to pay for it?
Who in the crowd is actually following News and Guts, or Mr. Rather?
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
Excellent. So that actually leads to a question that I have, and I've wanted to ask. And so you mentioned a very colorful story about Lyndon Baines Johnson and his reluctance to accept something that seemed to be verifiably true. It seems nowadays there's a lot of conversations and a lot of presentations where people say, definitively, this thing happened. We have it on video, we've recorded it, but then somebody will say, well, let's hear the other side of this. There's a lot of other side-isms going on with things that are pretty black and white. So how do you, as a journalist and somebody who's consumed media for a very long time, how do you approach the idea of there might be another side to see of this whole issue? What was said or what was performed or what happened did indeed happen. How do you sort of deal with people saying, well, that's a biased source, what's the other side?
Well, first of all, this discussion has been going on as long as I've been a journalist. This is not unique to the internet age. I grant you a combination of the internet age and the way some political forces are operating. It's been accentuated in recent days. There's so much in this, but very quickly. First of all, to say it is true that with some things there are 2 points of view, not necessarily equal points of view, and you have to be careful of false equivalency, which we heard a lot about during the campaign, is a real problem. But often it isn't a matter of two sides, one side or the other. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 sides.
Right.
But sometimes there is only one side when it's a demonstrable fact. This is why I say we're in a different, especially perilous time at the moment, because they are very powerful political forces and ideological forces in the country who try to get people to believe, listen, for everything, there's no such thing as a fact. They're alternate facts.
Right.
Fact is fungible. To use a Texas expression, bullshine. That is not true. No. There are some things that are a demonstrable fact. 2 and 2 equals 4. That there's no alternative. 2 and 2 may equal 5, or 2 and 2 may equal 10. Water does not run uphill.
Right.
Gravity is a fact. So there are things. So the challenge has always been for journalists to clearly identify what's a demonstrable fact when it's not a provable, demonstrable fact, but there's strong circumstantial evidence by the legal standard beyond a reasonable doubt to report it and report it that way. Also a responsibility to say what you don't know. I always felt as anchor on some national event, such as particularly tragedies, space shuttle explosion, earthquake. It was really important to tell people, this is what we know, this is what we think we know, and this is what we don't know. But at any rate, in dealing with it, and to be careful of this, many of the same people who say, well, they don't give the other side, they're really looking for a false equivalency. That if you have one person saying, just to use the most elemental thing, if you have one person saying 2 and 2 equals 4, and you have another person saying, no, on Wednesdays 2 and 2 equals 5, and on Fridays 2 and 2 equals 7, it's ridiculous to give the person who's over here the same amount of space, the same amount of attention. You can say, thank you. You can say that that's oversimplified, but in the most direct way, that's the way to put it. Now, in the matter of bias, this is as old as journalism. Nobody does journalism perfectly. Journalism is not a precise science. It is, on its best days, a kind of crude art, in which what the journalist is trying to do is, when possible, establish facts, hard facts, and to get as close to the truth as is humanly possible. That's what the journalist is trying to do. This is in the great tradition of American journalism. Now, nobody does it perfectly on the journalist side, but a lot of the accusations about bias are through the prism of prejudice, which is to say, if you don't like the way the war is going, and somebody reports from the field the war's not going well, there's a tendency to say, you know what, that's a biased reporter. And we could go on with any number of examples, including race relations and reporting about it. So for the journalist, it's uncomfortable, but it goes with the territory to explain, look, I'm not perfect. I can't tell you that every day on every story in every way that I'm completely objective, but that is what I'm trying to do. And judge me over a fair amount of time on how well I do it, and I'm prepared to go with that judgment.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I love this question because we're Texans in Texas, talking about Texas things. This is Kate Messer's question. She opens by saying, howdy, Mr. Rather.
Howdy, Kate.
You were the man on the ground and in the water during Hurricane Carla in 1961 for KHOU in Houston. Could you reflect on how far we've come with hurricane information dissemination and how you feel about the current coverage of this season's brutal parade of storms? And there's a P.S. Thank you for inspiring so many of us to never give up. Courage.
Thank you. Thank you. Katie, was it? Katie? Katie?
Yes.
Yeah.
Katie.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate that, particularly appreciate the latter. Well, when it comes to talking hurricanes, I could fill up the rest of the night. Rest assured, I'm not going to do that. No, I was very fortunate when I came to hurricane coverage for television because I grew up on the Texas coast, and I grew up with people, including my maternal grandmother, who knew the history, the legend, and the lore of hurricanes from way back. And I was hearing about hurricanes, living through hurricanes for all of my early life. And I had covered them for radio. Now, with this coverage of Hurricane Carla in 1961, September of 1961, it was at that time, and I believe it still is, in terms of geographical circumference, the largest hurricane on record in the Gulf. Also one of the most powerful, with at times wind gusts above 200 miles an hour. But what happened in brief, that you asked me, so the lady asked how we gone, not intending to do so, and it wasn't because we were bright, because we aren't, at Channel 11 KHOU in Houston, when Carla first moved across the Yucatan Peninsula and got back into the open Gulf, you know, I knew the state of weather reporting in general was not nearly what it is today. And the weather reporting on television basically dealt with the local news, weather, if that. But at any rate, I knew that the hurricane could be, as we would say in Texas and Texan, a big one, a really big one. So I kept an eye on it. But anyway, I also knew that the Weather Bureau had just installed, very shortly before that, a radar on Galveston Island. Now, we talk about how things have changed. At that time, radar had been used during World War II for military operations, but it was just beginning to be used on a regular basis for weather prediction. And the U.S. Weather Bureau even only had a few radar stations. One was in Galveston, I knew that. We went to Galveston, and I did know that once the hurricane started coming, you couldn't get to Galveston. So we went to Galveston early and got there early, and one thing led to another. The first time I saw up on a radar screen a live picture of the massive hurricane with the eye, you know, I said to myself, you know, this is really a terrible hurricane. So the question became how and when should you translate that to people? I had the idea, it was a crazy idea, it seemed to me, well, to give people an idea of the size, not only the strength, the size of the hurricane, let's put this clear plastic, over a scale map of Texas and put the radar on it. Anyway, it turned out that no other station was doing that. And from that has grown a whole small industry of hurricane reporting, which in my own time as anchor, I covered, I think, 18 or 20 hurricanes. But now to the question of what the following things have changed. The whole science of weather predicting is far, far greater now than it was at the time of Carla. It's increased tremendously. But having said that, there's still mysteries we don't understand about hurricanes. In terms of news reporting about hurricanes, there's much more of it. Almost every station on any coast now at the first hint of a hurricane will jump and do it. And I will say what I've seen most recently with Harvey on our own coast and in southwest Louisiana, with the reporting out of Florida and the reporting out of Puerto Rico, I think the reporting has been uniformly good to excellent. There are certain things I would certainly, say to myself, well, it's not quite up to standard, but good. And part of that is because television equipment has been miniaturized. Many more people are going down for coverage. So looking forward, I think it's very important for people to understand, although in terms of predictions, that great advances have been made, that hurricanes are still the great mystery. Monstrous mysteries in many important ways, even with our latest technology. And in terms of reporting, I think we have reached a point where it's probably a good idea to ask ourselves, those of us in journalism, to be sure we emphasize fundamentals, to tell what we know when we know it, what we think we know and what we don't know. Because often, and I do not accept myself as criticism, in the fury of competition and wanting to be first, sometimes there's a tendency to overstate what might happen as opposed to what is happening.
Thank you. Here's a question on world affairs from Don Bartlett. Don asks, with the economic and geopolitical rise of China and other nations, do you believe that our more acute issues are the inevitable result of the general decline of our global stature? Is the apparent decline avoidable, or are we headed for a recalibration of America's role in the world? A lot of hmms in the crowd.
No. Well, whether we're in for a recalibration of our role in the world depends mightily on what's just ahead of us. There are some big decisions to be made. Beginning, I would think, are we to engage in yet another war with Korea or with Iran? Those problems we can't foresee. I do think, as a personal opinion, based on my experience, but also tempered by the knowledge that I am by nature and by experience an optimist, I think the reports of our decline have been, if not exaggerated, overstated. And I recognize the reasons that people talk about decline of the American era. And the rise of China is one of those things. But again, with this country, we need to remember the following things. First, no president is stronger than the people of the United States as a whole, no matter how bad you think any given president is. That's one. Two, we have, as a people, as a nation, as a society, we have really demonstrated remarkable resilience over the whole existence of this experiment, which we call the United States of America. Time after time, we've been a resilient people. Now, I know there are many people who say, well, that was yesterday. This is today. We're different demographically. The culture is changing, so forth and so on. But I'm suspicious of spending too much time worrying about our decline. I do think, and as again the overall head of the University of Texas system said on the stage last night, it's easy to think about a decline in terms of clashing armies, clashing ideologies, and volatile economics. But our biggest national security problems are, and I'm quoting your own head of the agency, education, education, and education. But, we know down where we live, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or mugwump, whatever you want to call yourself, we know down deep that the key to whatever is to happen to us in the future, the key to our national security, the key to our economic strength, the key to who and what we are in the world and whether we continue to be a world leader, depend on our education system. And we've let it get decrepit in some ways. We've let it, in the same way we let our infrastructure, such as highways and bridges, not keep up with the times. We've done that with education. Now, I'm a product of public schools. I never saw the inside of anything other than a public institution. Love Elementary School, Hamilton Junior High School, what was then Reagan High School, Sam Houston State Teachers College, and so forth. And I'm a great supporter of public schools, and I'm here to make the case that public schools are the backbone of our education system, and must remain so. But I take nothing away, and I listen carefully to people who have other views. I understand about charter schools, parochial schools, private school, homeschooling. But wherever you stand on that spectrum of opinion about education, we need to get busy and address the fact that as a country, there are spots where we're pretty good. We trail in educating our young people. And that's our number one priority. And again, that's just me, not me saying this. The chancellor of your own system said it from the stage last night, and a lot of thinking people would agree. Now, if we get ourselves together with our education system, if we learn from others, as others learn from us, over years the world learned from us about how to run a public school system. Now places like Finland and Singapore, we can learn from them. But, you know, I often say of myself, and I think it's true of Americans in general as far as we generalize, we don't always learn fast, but we learn good. And I think we're in the process of recognizing this today. If we do this, you know, our likely chances. That China gets a lot of attention, as indeed it should, and they'd be complimented. They've accomplished a great deal. But they have their problems. They have deep and abiding problems. And so the idea that suddenly by 2035 or 2050, that China will be the dominant world power, economically and militarily, could be, might be. But, you know, the good book said the race is not always to the swift nor the battle to the strong, but the reporter's corollary to that, that is the way to bet it. And if you have to bet, I think by any reasonable analysis of the odds, you'd have to bet that our United States of America goes through this particularly trying, perilous time and comes out remaining a world leader. Others may also develop leadership roles, but I think ours will be there.
Thank you. Here's a question that harkens back to your earlier days, and it's a good question from Gloria. And Gloria asks, have you ever had the chance to go back to Vietnam soldiers and just talk about that war from your point of view and theirs? If so, can you share some of that time in that moment?
Well, certainly I have. The ranks of Vietnam veterans, time takes its toll. But I've always made a point, certainly when I was in Vietnam and in the times when I immediately got out, and over the years have talked to them about the experience. You know, and I find that it's very difficult to generalize, and I want to be very careful that I don't speak for Vietnam veterans. Only those who wore the uniform are entitled to speak to their worries and cares, what they thought about the war. Not people such as myself who were there as eyewitnesses, but the people who wore the uniform. But it was true during the Vietnam War, it was true in the first years after the Vietnam War, and it's been true ever since. That the following things are what veterans, particularly those veterans who were in frontline combat units. Number one is they lament that while it's gotten better, that particularly during the Vietnam War years and just after, but even now, particularly young people who didn't move in, this is their lament. They don't complain about it. They wish it were otherwise. And understanding that it may have been the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. But those Americans who fought the war, they went for the right reasons. Those reasons being, in no particular order, we the American people through our leadership, asked them to go as a duty. And number two, they love their country. That's why they went. And they never, as a general rule, there's a feeling they never quite got credit for it. A lot of them never asked credit, said, look, that's just the way it is. But you ask them what the conversation is. Frequently the conversation goes along that line. Others, and there's a long list, and we will go through them all, others is that Vietnam veterans feel, since we as a country, as a people, as a society now, have been at war for 16, going on 17 successive years in Afghanistan and elsewhere, is the understanding of why our warriors fight. And there's a great misunderstanding, which is generally shared by veterans who have fought wars, even going back to Korean War, World War II. And the belief that where the work is, where in the hell of the savageries at war, that the people who fight it do it for a lot of reasons. But the biggest reasons are somewhat surprising. They don't want to let their comrades to the right and left down.
in the forefront of overwhelmingly combat soldiers, Marines, and others is, I can't let my fellow unit members down. Can't let the guy on the right and left down. Just can't let them down. Second is a fear. What they fear is that they will die, and no one will ever know how it really was. It's difficult to sometimes for those who fight wars to express it, but that feeling, listen, I'm going to die here. Okay, I'm prepared to die here, but if I die here, you know, nobody's ever going to know what it was like, So the conversations go along that line. But most Vietnam veterans, military veterans that I speak with, they're very much aware that the Vietnam War is a long time ago. And while many of our present problems can be traced with a bloodline back to the Vietnam War, the people who fought the Vietnam War understand that for most Americans alive today, the Vietnam War sort of seems as far away as Caesar's campaigns or Alexander on the ringing windy plains of Troy a long time ago.
Well, as a Vietnam veteran's son, I appreciate you having those conversations. It's very important. Thank you. Time for another question, maybe? One more question. Okay. So this is a question from
This is interesting. This is like baseball. You're looking at the third base.
Yeah, I'm looking for a signal. You know, I could be up here all night with you. That would not be a problem for me, but
No,
I want
I
to make sure
understand.
you're preserved.
I understand.
This is a question from Ann Stanley. And Ann asked the question, there has been criticism of the press in the coverage of the presidential elections. What does the press need to do differently in covering the 2018 midterm elections?
Well, again, I'm pausing only because there are few things worse than, some aged, declining anchor person trying to tell the press they're going to cover the next election. But I want to be responsive to the question. And by the way, I hope I'm around and I hope I have my health for the next election. I love covering politics. I love covering politicians. I always look forward to campaigns. But in answer to the question, I think the press in general, and again, it's awfully hard to generalize about the press, but some of the lessons learned from the 2016 election going forward can be applied to press coverage. I think in no particular order. Number one, that there needs to be more what I call deep digging investigative reporting earlier on. Now, having said from the podium not long ago that I'm encouraged by what investigative reporting we're seeing now. We're seeing it come back. But during the campaign, there wasn't nearly enough. And again, it's expensive, it takes time. We have our excuses, but frankly, none of the excuses should apply to the next time. So as much investigative reporting early in the campaign, including during primary campaigns, as opposed to just putting candidates on without very much analysis, genuine analysis, fact-based investigative reporting with it, is one of the lessons we can learn from the last campaign. And to be more substance-oriented. We've gone through this with every political campaign I've covered, and I've covered national political campaigns since 1952, that every year we say we're going to do it better, that we're going to put on the air in the case of television, put in print in the case of print, put on the air in the case of radio, far less hyperbole coming from the candidates, far more of their own personal boosterism, and ask tougher questions. But I do think going forward to 2020 that you will see much, when I say tougher questions, much more substantive questions, much more consistently asked earlier, through the early and middle parts of the campaign than we saw in 2016. I certainly hope so.
Yeah. I'll be really honest. I would love to hear some of those great Dan Rather metaphors at election night about frogs on roofs and what have you, those kinds of things.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Mr. Rather for this wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was great.
Thank you.
You were a pro.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.